She accepted his ring while I was still holding the brass-wrapped pressure gauge. I want you to think about that. Not the betrayal. You'll understand the structural rot behind that soon enough. I want you to think about the gauge. A calibrated, liquid-filled 3000 psi pressure gauge wrapped in unbleached butcher paper and tied with tarred marline twine. The exact heavy-duty cordage Clara always said looked more honest than polished chrome gift boxes. I drove 45 minutes across the Puget Sound freeze from my marine hydraulics shop, idling through thick Seattle rain after a 12-hour shift overhauling turbine valves. I stopped at that small maritime supply shop near the docks she'd pointed out 3 times over the past year without ever asking me to stop. And I'd finally remembered. I stood in the entry foyer of that coastal manor with that heavy gauge in my hands. And the man on one knee in the center of the hardwood floor wasn't me. That image, that single visual, is the one that stays locked in my mind. Not what happened after. Not the legal filings. Just that moment of standing in the doorway of a house full of people, holding a brass gauge wrapped in butcher paper, watching my wife's face light up in a way it hadn't in a very long time. My name is Marcus Vance. I am 34 years old. I overhaul high-pressure hydraulic systems for commercial vessels and tugboats in Seattle, Washington. And what I am about to tell you is the most calculated, methodical, and quietly ruinous thing I have ever done in my life. But before we get there, before we get to what I did and what happened at my workshop door 3 hours later, let me start where the pressure actually began to build. Because nothing that happened at that birthday party makes sense unless you understand the structural stress that came before it. And what came before it goes back about 11 months. I met Clara at an aviation and marine systems expo in Tacoma when we were both 28. She was in corporate logistics for shipping lines. I was presenting a breakdown of a failed hydraulic pump casing my shop had re-engineered. She sat in the third row and asked the only question after my talk that was actually worth answering. That was it. We talked for 2 hours after the panel ended, missed the industry dinner entirely, and sat on the wooden benches by the marina until midnight, because neither of us wanted to cut the connection. She was sharp. That was the thing about Clara that nobody who knew her casually ever fully appreciated. People saw the way she carried herself and assumed she was just another polished corporate suit. She wasn't. She had an analytical mind that could cut straight through bad data. She could trace a structural fault before the metal even started to fatigue. It was the quality that made her exceptional at her job. It was also, I would eventually understand, the quality that made her exceptional at hiding things. We dated for 2 years, and were married on a bluff overlooking the Sound on a crisp Saturday in October. My parents flew in from Spokane. Her parents drove up from Portland. My brother Liam was my best man, and gave a toast that was honestly funnier than a room full of harbor mechanics had any right to expect. We spent a week in a cabin near the Olympic Peninsula. Clara got a little sun-chapped on the trail the second day, and spent the rest of the trip wrapped in oversized flannel. I thought she was the most resilient, beautiful thing I'd ever built a life around. The first 4 years of our marriage were solid. Not movie script dramatic, not social media flashy, genuinely, quietly solid. The kind of mechanical stability where every gear meshes without heat or vibration. We rented a small house with a detached garage near Puget Sound. I worked long hours at the shop. She had an office downtown and came home every evening smelling like the specific cold air conditioning of the glass tower on 2nd Avenue where her logistics firm was headquartered. We prepped shop engines on weekends. We had standing plans with 2 other couples on the first Saturday of every month. We were predictable in the best possible way. Then she got recruited by an international freight conglomerate. New title, massive salary bump, and an entirely new tier of corporate executives she was suddenly traveling with. That part one understood. What I didn't understand, what took me embarrassingly long to process, was the shift that came with it. The late-night dock audit dinners, that were always with high-profile clients. The conference trips to Vancouver and San Francisco that seemed to double every quarter. The way her phone had started landing face down on the kitchen counter when she set it down. A habit she had never had in 4 years of marriage. Small indicators, each one entirely defensible on its own, but together forming a stress line I kept refusing to run a diagnostic on. I want to be transparent with you. I am not the kind of man who ignores obvious system warnings, and then acts shocked when a line blows. I consider myself observant. I consider myself logical. But there is a particular form of deliberate blindness that takes over when the thing you'd have to inspect directly is the reality that the person you anchored your life to has decided to chart a completely different course. You don't ignore it because you're stupid. You ignore it because running the test means dealing with the failure. And for a long time, I wasn't ready to take the system offline. The name Vance Sterling entered my life about 11 months ago. It came through the most ordinary door possible. Clara mentioned him over dinner. He'd been brought in as a high-end maritime logistics consultant for her firm's regional expansion. Some polished strategist who had worked major shipping ports across North America. She described him as brilliant and mildly insufferable. The tone she used was the exact tone people use when they find someone dangerously fascinating. I stored the name in the back of my mind and said nothing. I looked him up 2 days later. Vance Sterling, 41. Based out of Vancouver, but operating across the Pacific Northwest. Flawless professional profile. A high-end portrait that cost more than my first set of shop tools. And a personal media feed that had the carefully managed, effortless gloss of a man who spent a lot of time crafting his image. He drove a customized Porsche Cayenne and spent a substantial amount of time at private yacht clubs. He was by standard metrics impressive. His corporate credentials were real. His firm's reputation was solid. He was also spending a suspicious amount of time in Seattle. I never confronted Clara. I want to make that explicitly clear. Every time something surfaced, an uncharacteristic charge at a waterfront restaurant we had never visited together. A night she walked through the door unusually quiet with a tension that felt like holding back a secret. I made a choice. Not the passive choice of a man who lacks the spine to ask, but the active choice of a technician logging data. I work in heavy marine mechanics. My entire career is built on a single rule. You never apply a fix until you fully map the failure. You gather pressure readings. You check the schematics. You isolate every variable. You don't make a move until you know exactly what is happening inside the line. So I gathered data. For 8 months, I gathered quietly while our domestic life proceeded on the surface as if the structural integrity was at 100%. We still made coffee together on Sundays. We still kept our monthly dinners with friends. I still cleared the snow off her windshield on freezing mornings, and I still picked up her favorite roast from the coffee house near the docks on days she had heavy board meetings. I was patient. I was methodical. I was calculating 3 moves ahead. By the time her 33rd birthday approached, I knew every parameter of the situation. I knew who Vance Sterling was to my wife. I knew how long the line had been leaking. I knew the exact geometry of it. And I had made a series of very quiet, legally ironclad decisions that she had absolutely no idea were taking place. The birthday party was her idea, which I will state for the record, not mine. She'd mentioned wanting a small gathering with close associates at the Bainbridge Island waterfront house owned by her colleague, Sarah Miller. Nothing massive, just the core circle. I told her that sounded fine. I meant it, though not for the reason she assumed. I told her I'd arrive by 7 p.m. I explained that I had a late delivery of overhauled hydraulic valves coming in from a harbor barge that might run over, but I'd be across the bay as soon as it cleared. She said okay. She kissed my cheek on her way out the door that afternoon. I stood in our kitchen holding my truck keys, watching her drive away, knowing she had no concept of what the evening was actually designed to execute. I parked my diesel truck on the upper gravel driveway of the Bainbridge house at 7:14 p.m. I sat in the cab for exactly 3 minutes. Not because my hands were shaking. I want to be precise about this. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't spiraling. I wasn't second-guessing a single variable. I was calibrating the timing. In mechanics and in life, the difference between entering a system 2 minutes early or 2 minutes late changes the entire distribution of force. I had calculated the window carefully. I wanted to walk in after the event had settled into its natural flow. After people had 2 drinks, lowered their guard, and settled into the warm, relaxed atmosphere that a party takes on 40 minutes in. When everyone stops projecting and starts simply existing. I got out of the truck with the 3000 psi gauge wrapped in butcher paper, walked down the stone path toward the waterfront house, and stepped through the unlocked side entry into the main salon. Sarah's husband, Mark, was standing near the hall. He's a decent guy. We'd done some coastal fishing together the summer prior. He saw me, and a sudden flicker crossed his face, the specific expression of a man who realizes a disaster is unfolding right in front of him, but has zero leverage to stop it. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I heard the room before I saw it. The layered sound of glasses, laughter, low ambient music. About 30 people spread through the timber-framed living space. And then I saw the center of the room. The crowd had naturally formed a wide, open semicircle. The organic clearing that happens when a room clears space for a central performance. In the middle of that clearing, kneeling on Sarah's rug, was Vance Sterling. He was impeccably put together. Tailored charcoal jacket, no tie, relaxed luxury. He was holding an open velvet box, and the heavy diamond ring inside was catching the recessed ceiling lights in a way that felt entirely rehearsed. And standing directly in front of him, both hands pressed against her mouth, eyes wide, was my wife, Clara. Wearing the midnight blue dress I had helped her pick out for a logistics gala 2 years prior. Standing in the center of a room full of her friends on her 33rd birthday, while a man who was not her husband proposed to her on one knee. The room was completely silent. I was standing in the archway holding a heavy brass gauge wrapped in brown paper, and not a single person had noticed my entry yet. That is the power of exact timing. When you nail it, you capture a truth that was never meant to be witnessed. What I observed in those 4 seconds before anyone registered my presence was Clara's face. I had been married to this woman for 5 years. I knew her expressions the way an engineer knows a schematic he drew by hand. Every nuance, every subtle tell. And what I saw on her face in that moment was not guilt. It was not the panic of someone caught between two lives. It was pure, unguarded, blinding radiance. She was thrilled. She was completely, genuinely happy. She said yes. I heard the word clearly. I heard the low murmur of approval start to build in the room. And then someone near the bar turned. I think it was Sarah's sister. She saw me standing in the archway with the package in my hands, and I watched the color drain from her face in real time. Then came the chain reaction. Heads turning, conversation cutting out. A wave of silence moving across the room the way cold air hits a heated space. Clara turned last. The radiance on her face was replaced by an expression, I will not bother breaking down for you. I will only say it confirmed every single piece of data I had spent 8 months logging. I stood there for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough to ensure my presence was fully registered. Long enough for Vance Sterling to stand up from his knee and realize the structural layout of his scene had just collapsed. Long enough for 30 people to internalize the exact shape of what they were participating in. Then I walked over to the heavy mahogany sideboard near the door, set the butcher paper wrapped pressure gauge down gently. No slam, no dramatic drop, just placing it down the way you set down a tool you no longer have a use for, turned on my heel, and walked out into the rain. Stay with me here, because this is where most people assume the narrative devolves into emotional collapse. The long, miserable drive back, sitting in a dark room, staring at the floor, calling a friend to vent. That is not what occurred. I drove back across the bridge to my workshop on the Seattle waterfront. I unlocked the security gate, parked the truck inside the bay, walked into my office, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop. Because here is what Clara didn't know. What Vance Sterling didn't know. What the 30 people at that party who were already texting each other frantically certainly didn't know. The brass gauge sitting on Sarah Miller's sideboard wasn't the only thing I had prepared for her birthday. Let me rewind 6 weeks. The lease on our residential house near the Sound was up for renewal in 2 months. It was in both of our names. 60 days prior, I had initiated the process of removing myself from the lease entirely. I had met directly with the property manager, a straight-shooting woman named Martha, explained the situation without emotional flair, and signed the necessary release documentation. My name was officially off the lease effective at the end of the term. The property, along with its full monthly financial obligation, belonged exclusively to Clara. The joint capital account we had used since our 2nd year of marriage had been systematically restructured over the previous 45 days. Not cleared out, I have no interest in illegal asset seizures, nor was I entitled to take what wasn't mine. But every single dollar I had generated through my business, Every contract deposit bearing my corporate name had been redirected into a new account under a separate entity at a different institution. The joint account remained open. There was money in it. It was simply adjusted to reflect her sole contributions over that period. The balance was drastically different from what she was accustomed to seeing. Then there was the heavy-duty Ford F-350 she used for hauling her personal gear. We had acquired it together, but because of a commercial tax structure I set up when I bought out my shop partners, the title and loan were registered exclusively under my business entity, Vance Hydraulics LLC. The loan had been paid off in full 14 months ago. The title was held in my office safe. It was my property. She drove it daily. She simply didn't realize that her authorization to operate that vehicle was expiring at midnight. And finally, there was the envelope tucked beneath the Marlene twine on that butcher paper gift sitting on the mahogany sideboard. I had spent 6 weeks assembling that envelope. It contained a short handwritten note. "Happy birthday, Clara. By the time you read this, the documentation inside will clarify the operational status of our marriage. I think you'll find the accounting accurate. The lease severance documentation. Signed by me, executed by Martha, confirming my legal removal from the residence. The bank ledger statement, showing the updated, separated balance of the joint account as of 5 p.m. that afternoon. The legal notice, formally notifying her that divorce proceedings had been filed through my attorney, Arthur Vance, a veteran maritime corporate lawyer who happens to be my uncle, and a man who does not waste time on emotional posturing. The photograph, a single 4x6 print, not of her and Vance Sterling. I had no interest in collecting trash. It was a photo of Clara and me taken 5 years ago during a breakdown on a mountain pass in the Cascades. Our old truck's radiator had blown. We were miles from a service station, soaked in cold rain, sharing a thermos of stale coffee on the tailgate, laughing. I had written one sentence on the back. This memory was real. The rest of the system has failed. By 9:30 p.m., sitting at my workshop desk, my phone was lighting up continuously. I had 214 missed notifications. Dozens of calls from Clara. Rapid-fire texts from her friends accusing me of orchestrating a scene. 2 calls from an unrecognized Vancouver area code that resolved to Vance Sterling's direct corporate office line. I ignored every single one of them. I cleared off my workbench, prepped 3 valve assemblies for the morning crew, turned off the shop lights, and went up to the small studio apartment above the workshop floor that I had quietly furnished 3 weeks prior. I read a technical manual for 20 minutes, turned off the lamp, and went to sleep. The knock on the heavy shop door came at 11:47 p.m. I lay in bed for a second, listening to the metallic echo reverberate through the lower bay. I wasn't surprised. I had anticipated she would show up. I had simply expected her an hour earlier. I pulled on a pair of work pants and a heavy canvas shirt, walked down the metal stairs, and unlocked the side pedestrian door. Clara was standing under the exterior halogen lights in her wet midnight blue dress. She had a dark coat thrown over her shoulders. Her hair was damp from the Puget Sound drizzle, and she was holding the brass gauge and the manila envelope against her chest. Her eyes were bloodshot, but her posture was rigid. Clara was never a frantic person, but the edges of her composure were entirely frayed. She looked at me for a long, silent beat. Then she held up the envelope. "You planned this," she said. Her voice was flat, tight, strained. "The accounts, the residential lease, all of it." "Come inside," I said, stepping back from the door. "It's raining." She walked into the shop bay, her heels clicking on the sealed concrete floor. She looked around at the heavy lathes, the hydraulic rigs, the overhead cranes, a space she rarely visited, and then set the manila envelope down on my main steel workbench right next to a disassembled hydraulic manifold. She stared at the envelope for a moment before turning to face me. "How long?" she asked. 8 months, I said, standing with my hands in my pockets. She closed her eyes briefly, taking a slow, controlled breath. "And you just let everything continue? You let me walk into tonight?" "I don't execute a repair until I understand the entire system failure," I told her. "You know how I work. I gather data until the diagnostic is absolute." She was quiet. Her eyes drifted to the 4x6 photograph sticking slightly out of the envelope flap. Why put the mountain photo in there, Marcus? Is that supposed to hurt me? No, I said calmly. It's to remind you that I know the difference between what we actually built and the theatrical noise you've been participating in for the last year. I don't hate you, Clara. Hate requires energy, and I'm not wasting power on a dead circuit. She flinched slightly, a tiny, almost imperceptible micro-expression, but I caught it. Vance and I. It wasn't supposed to happen like that tonight, she said, her voice dropping. He proposed to you in front of 30 people, I said. And you said yes while I was standing 5 feet away with a birthday gift. The intent is clear. There's nothing left to interpret. Silence hung in the shop bay, heavy with the smell of hydraulic fluid and cold metal. The truck? She asked quietly. The F-350 is registered under Vance Hydraulics LLC, I replied. You can drive it back to the house tonight. I expect the keys on this workbench by 5 p.m. on Friday, or Arthur will file a recovery notice. His contact card is in the envelope. You hired Arthur, she stated. It wasn't a question. Arthur is thorough, I said. You should retain someone equally precise. Don't rush the choice. She stared at me for a long time, searching my face, looking for the anger, the pain, the leverage point she could use to negotiate or reframe the situation. She was reading me the way she read corporate contracts, searching for a clause she could exploit. She found nothing, because I wasn't performing. I wasn't holding back an explosion. I had processed the grief 6 months ago while staring at credit card statements and late-night location tags. By the time I walked into Sarah Miller's house, the emotional work was complete. What do you actually want out of this, Marcus? She asked softly. A clean disconnect, I said. No dragged-out litigation. No dramatic lingering issues. You made a choice to build a life with someone else. I am simply clearing my inventory so I can run my business. She looked down at the brass gauge sitting on the workbench. The butcher paper was damp from the rain. You remembered the gauge, she whispered. I remember every specification, I said. That's always been my function. She stood there for another 10 seconds, then slowly reached down, picked up her handbag, and left the envelope and the brass gauge sitting on the steel table. She walked to the pedestrian door, paused with her hand on the frame, but didn't look back. I'll have my lawyer reach out to Arthur, she said. That's the correct move, I replied. The door clicked shut behind her. I heard the F-350 start up in the lot, its diesel engine idling for a moment before the sound faded down the street into the Seattle rain. Let me tell you what happened in the months that followed. Not the full legal ledger. Arthur would reprimand me for putting specific court filings on the record, but enough so you understand how the rest of the machinery operated. Vance Sterling, as it turned out, was operating on a system that was far closer to structural failure than his tailored suits suggested. During the discovery phase of our asset distribution, Arthur ran a standard corporate check on Sterling's regional logistics firm. The Porsche was leased under a high-interest corporate line. His firm was fighting 2 major breach of contract suits in British Columbia, and the diamond ring he had used on Bainbridge Island had been purchased on a commercial credit line that was currently delinquent. He wasn't a complete fraud. His business existed, but he was a man running a high-pressure system with thin walls, relying on an image of extreme wealth to pull in new investors before the old debts caught up with him. Clara didn't know any of this. She knew the version of Vance Sterling that Vance Sterling projected at high-end marina lounges. I knew the actual balance sheet, because I spent 8 months verifying who my wife was replacing me with. I didn't expose him publicly. I didn't send anonymous tips to his clients. I don't engage in petty sabotage. I simply ensured that Arthur provided a clear, documented financial breakdown to Clara's legal counsel during our settlement negotiations to prove that joint marital assets had been funneled toward private travel during her time with him. When Clara realized the true state of Sterling's leverage, and when she realized she no longer had the stable, debt-free backing of my shop's cash flow, the relationship disintegrated under the pressure. Within 4 months, the engagement was off. I moved forward with my work. I expanded the shop bay, hired 2 new mechanics, and took on a major maintenance contract with a regional ferry line. About 2 months ago, I received a text from Sarah Miller, Clara's colleague who hosted the birthday party. It read, "Marcus, I think you should know. Clara has been sitting in her car across from your shop on rain nights. She's done it 3 times this month. She doesn't know I know. I looked at the message for a moment, then set the phone down on my desk next to my mug of black coffee. I didn't reply. I don't feel malice toward Clara. Malice requires thermal energy, and I keep my systems running cold. What I feel is the quiet satisfaction of a completed job. My name is Marcus Vance. I overhaul high-pressure hydraulic systems, and I have never, in my entire career, reinstalled a component that I knew was built to fail under load. What happened at that birthday party wasn't the start of my reaction. It was simply the moment the output became visible to the room. Everything else had already been calculated. Everything else had already been executed. By the time she knocked on my workshop door at 11:47 p.m. with rain on her dress, I wasn't preparing to leave. I had already left. Quietly, precisely, completely. The way you leave when you've run the diagnostics, know the system is unrecoverable, and made sure that when you step away, you leave nothing behind that you needed to keep.